desperately matured. At last they had developed to the point where Eve consented to have a secret conference with Kano, the most brilliant mind and active leader of the nearby colony of friendly Nodites. Kano was very sympathetic with the Adamic regime. In fact, he was the sincere spiritual leader of those neighboring Nodites who favored friendly relations with the garden. The fateful meeting occurred during the twilight hours of the autumn evening, not far from the home of Adam. Eve had never before met the beautiful and enthusiastic Kano, and he was a magnificent specimen of the survival of the superior physique and outstanding intellect of his remote progenitors of the prince's staff. And Kano also thoroughly believed in the righteousness of the Seripatia project. Outside of the garden, multiple mating was a common practice. Influenced by flattery, enthusiasm, and great personal persuasion, Eve then and there consented to embark upon the much-discussed enterprise, to add her own little scheme of world-saving to the larger and more far-reaching divine plan. Before she quite realized what was transpiring, the fatal step had been taken. It was done. 4. The realization of default. The celestial life of the planet was astir. Adam recognized that something was wrong, and he asked Eve to come aside with him in the garden. And now, for the first time, Adam heard the entire story of the long-nourished plan for accelerating world improvement by operating simultaneously in two directions, the prosecution of the divine plan concomitantly with the execution of the Seripatia enterprise. And as the material son and daughter thus communed in the moonlit garden, the voice in the garden reproved them for disobedience, and that voice was none other than my own announcement to the Edenic pair that they had transgressed the garden covenant, that they had disobeyed the instructions of the Melchizedeks, that they had defaulted in the execution of their oaths of trust to the sovereign of the universe. Eve had consented to participate in the practice of good and evil. Good is the carrying out of the divine plans. Sin is a deliberate transgression of the divine will. Evil is the misadaptation of plans and the maladjustment of techniques resulting in universe disharmony and planetary confusion. Every time the garden pair had partaken of the fruit of the tree of life, they had been warned by the archangel custodian to refrain from yielding to the suggestions of Caligastia to combine good and evil. They had been thus admonished, "In the day that you commingle good and evil, you shall surely become as the mortals of the realm. You shall surely die." Eve had told Kano of this oft-repeated warning on the fateful occasion of their secret meeting, but Kano, not knowing the import or significance of such admonitions, had assured her that men and women with good motives and true intentions could do no evil, that she should surely not die, but rather live anew in the person of their offspring, who would grow up to bless and stabilize the world. Even though this project of modifying the divine plan had been conceived and executed with entire sincerity and with only the highest motives concerning the welfare of the world, it constituted evil because it represented the wrong way to achieve righteous ends, because it departed from the right way, the divine plan. True, Eve had found Kano pleasant to the eyes, and she realized all that her seducer promised by way of new and increased knowledge of human affairs and quickened understanding of human nature as supplemental to the comprehension of the Adamic nature. I talked to the father and mother of the violet race that night in the garden as became my duty under the sorrowful circumstances. I listened fully to the recital of all that led up to the default of Mother Eve, and gave both of them advice and counsel concerning the immediate situation. Some of this advice they followed, some they disregarded. This conference appears in your records as the Lord God calling to Adam and Eve in the garden and asking, "Where are you?" It was the practice of later generations to attribute everything unusual and extraordinary, whether natural or spiritual, directly to the personal intervention of the gods. 5. Repercussions of default. Eve's disillusionment was truly pathetic. Adam discerned the whole predicament and, while heartbroken and dejected, entertained only pity and sympathy for his erring mate. It was in the despair of the realization of failure that Adam, the day after Eve's misstep, sought out Leata, the brilliant Nodite woman who was head of the Western schools of the garden, and with premeditation committed the folly of Eve. But do not misunderstand, Adam was not beguiled. He knew exactly what he was about. He deliberately chose to share the fate of Eve. He loved his mate with a supermortal affection, and the thought of the possibility of a lonely vigil on Urantia without her was more than he could endure. When they learned what had happened to Eve, the infuriated inhabitants of the garden became unmanageable. They declared war on the nearby Nodite settlement. They swept out through the gates of Eden and down upon these unprepared people, utterly destroying them. Not a man, woman, or child was spared. And Cano, the father of Cain yet unborn, also perished. Upon the realization of what had happened, Sarapatia was overcome with consternation and beside himself with fear and remorse. The next day he drowned himself in the great river. The children of Adam sought to comfort their distracted mother while their father wandered in solitude for 30 days. At the end of that time, judgment asserted itself, and Adam returned to his home and began to plan for their future course of action. The consequences of the follies of misguided parents are so often shared by their innocent children. The upright and noble sons and daughters of Adam and Eve were overwhelmed by the inexplicable sorrow of the unbelievable tragedy which had been so suddenly and so ruthlessly thrust upon them. Not in 50 years did the older of these children recover from the sorrow and sadness of those tragic days, especially the terror of that period of 30 days during which their father was absent from the home, while their distracted mother was in complete ignorance of his whereabouts or fate. And those same 30 days were as long years of sorrow and suffering to Eve. Never did this noble soul fully recover from the effects of that excruciating period of mental suffering and spiritual sorrow. No feature of their subsequent deprivations and material hardships ever began to compare in Eve's memory with those terrible days and awful nights of loneliness and unbearable uncertainty. She learned of the rash act of Sarapatia, and did not know whether her mate had in sorrow destroyed himself, or had been removed from the world in retribution for her misstep. And when Adam returned, Eve experienced a satisfaction of joy and gratitude that never was effaced by their long and difficult life partnership of toiling service. Time passed, but Adam was not certain of the nature of their offense until 70 days after the default of Eve, when the Melchizedek receivers returned to Urantia and assumed jurisdiction over world affairs. And then he knew they had failed. But still more trouble was brewing. The news of the annihilation of the Nodite settlement near Eden was not slow in reaching the home tribes of Sarapatia to the north, and presently a great host was assembling to march on the garden. And this was the beginning of a long and bitter warfare between the Adamites and the Nodites, for these hostilities kept up long after Adam and his followers emigrated to the second garden in the Euphrates Valley. There was intense and lasting enmity between that man and the woman, between his seed and her seed. 6. Adam and Eve leave the garden. When Adam learned that the Nodites were on the march, he sought the counsel of the Melchizedeks, but they refused to advise him, only telling him to do as he thought best, and promising their friendly cooperation, as far as possible, in any course he might decide upon. The Melchizedeks had been forbidden to interfere with the personal plans of Adam and Eve. Adam knew that he and Eve had failed. The presence of the Melchizedek receivers told him that, though he still knew nothing of their personal status or future fate. He held an all-night conference with some 1,200 loyal followers, who pledged themselves to follow their leader, and the next day at noon these pilgrims went forth from the garden in quest of new homes. Adam had no liking for war, and accordingly elected to leave the first garden to the Nodites unopposed. The Edenic caravan was halted on the 3rd day out from the garden by the arrival of the seraphic transports from Jerusalem, and for the first time Adam and Eve were informed of what was to become of their children. While the transports stood by, those children who had arrived at the age of choice, 20 years, were given the option of remaining on Urantia with their parents, or of becoming wards of the Most Highs of Norlatiadek. 2/3 chose to go to Edentia. About 1/3 elected to remain with their parents. All children of pre-choice age were taken to Urantia. No one could have beheld the sorrowful parting of this material son and daughter, and their children,